Hi everyone, how's it going? Welcome to the channel. Zach D Productions here, and I'm here for a ranking video for you guys. Now for this ranking, I'll be ranking the studio discography from the legendary heavy metal band Judas Priest. And Judas Priest are definitely a band that comes to mind when I think of an essential heavy metal band. I mean, if you call yourself a metalhead and you're not familiar with Judas Priest at all, I mean, you definitely got to change that. I mean, very soon, for sure. Definitely a really great band. Definitely one of metal's pioneers, and definitely an important band in the genre, too. Now, with this ranking, I don't own all of the Judas Priest albums, but of course you'll see which ones I have and which ones I don't have and everything like that. And I do like most of their albums. I would say that most of their albums are pretty strong, and of course they do have some classics, and yeah, so of course this ranking is just my opinion. You don't have to agree with my ranking. If your ranking is different than mine, that's totally fine with me, of course. This is just my opinion, so we're going to go from worst to best based on my opinion, of course, so let's go ahead and get started. And now, the two albums that I have at the bottom, I don't have in my collection yet, and they are the two albums with Ripper Owens, Demolition, and Jugular, I believe they're called. Yeah, this era of Judas Priest, you know, without Rob Halford, doesn't really do a whole lot for me. I mean, yeah, there's a few decent moments here and there in the Ripper Owens era of Judas Priest, but all in all, it doesn't do a whole lot for me. I mean, it's not the worst stuff that I've heard in metal or anything like that, but yeah, I know it's this era. These two albums in particular are low in a lot of people's rankings, and they're definitely at the bottom for me. So next in the ranking, I gotta go with Nostradamus, which is their concept album. And you know, given that this is a concept album, you'd think that this would be much more groundbreaking and, you know, much more interesting, but sadly it just kind of isn't. Now, is the album all bad? No, it does have its moments, but it is definitely one of their weakest, and a lot of people do have this rather low in the Judas Priest discography, and for good reason. Not a terrible album, but they've definitely done better than this. That's all I'm gonna say. So the next album up is Redeemer of Souls. Now, I know this album does have its fans, it does, and it's a decent album. I do think it's decent, but my main issue with this album is it does kind of just lack replay value, and that's why it's rather low in the ranking. It does have its moments, though. It definitely does. There's some pretty good songs on the album, and the production to this album is not too bad, and yeah, sound-wise, it's pretty good and everything, but it's just far from one of their best, in my opinion. But next, we got Ram It Down, which is the other Judas Priest album I don't own yet, of course. This album, in my opinion, is the weakest of their 80s time, but definitely not bad by any means. I think the title track is a pretty good track, but to me, it's just the least interesting of their 80s material. Definitely not bad, though, by any means. But moving on from that, we got their debut album, A Rolla. Now, I know that there's some people that would have this album close to last, but for me, I actually don't mind this album. I think the album is pretty good for what it is. I mean, I know that some people give this album some heat, mainly just due to the fact that, you know, it's kind of rock and roll-ish, if you know what I mean. But is that really a bad thing, though? You know, just because, you know, it might not be as metal as some of their other material, I mean, come on. Does that really make this a bad album? I mean, yeah, it's not one of their best or anything, but I think it's pretty good for what it is. I mean, you do got songs like One for the Road and the title track, which are pretty good songs. Now, the title track, yeah, it's kind of cheesy, kind of, dare I say, cringe if you want to really go that far. I personally kind of enjoy the track for what it is. But yeah, Rock and Rolla, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be, but it's definitely not one of their best. Alright, so next we got Point of Entry. With this album, I like it, but I don't love it, though. There's not much to say about it, but I do think that the song Heading Out to the Highway is a very good song. That's maybe my favorite song on the album, if not at least one of my favorites. Easily top 3 from this album for me personally. But yeah, good album, but definitely not one of their best. Next, we got Turbo, another album that I don't think is as bad as some people make it out to be, because I know that this album also received some heat from Priest fans, mainly just due to the fact that the album is kind of accessible sounding and kind of just, I guess, has that 80s sound to it, and it definitely does sound of its time for sure. I mean, of course, Turbo Lover, it's one of their popular tracks, and, you know, I don't mind that song. I mean, there's some pretty good songs on the album. Yeah, again, it sounds of its time, but I don't think it's bad, though. I think it's pretty good for what it is. Next, we got the Bent for Leather album, and I'm also going to throw Killing Machine into this placement of the ranking as well, just for the record. But yeah, not a bad album. I mean, not the best of their classic era, but I think it's pretty strong though. Once again, another album where I would say that I like it, but I don't love it though. I mean, there is some classic stuff on this album. I mean, pretty solid for the most part. Alright, so next we got Angel of Retribution, the comeback album with Rob Halford back in the band. This came out sometime in the early 2000s, and yeah, definitely a really solid comeback album in metal for sure. Some might even argue that this is one of the best comeback albums in heavy metal, and I can definitely see why. You know, the songwriting, not too bad on this. I mean, this is a pretty heavy album too, and this album has this sort of epic sound to it. I mean, you can definitely hear that, especially with the opening track, Judas Rising, with that epic build-up at the start. It's got some pretty intriguing sounding riffs and everything. I mean, there's of course other very good songs on the album, but yeah, Angel of Retribution, pretty solid for the most part. So next we got Sin After Sin. Pretty good album. Again, not the best of their classic era, but this is, of course, you know, another one of their albums that are very early on in their career, and this album is solid. I do think it's very solid. Of course, you got the song Sinner on here, which is a pretty good track, I would say. I mean, it's got a lot of interesting things going on. I enjoy pretty much everything about that song, mainly due to the instrumentation. I mean, I think in this album, like, they're really trying to step it up as far as instrumentation is concerned, you know, in their career. From this point on, I mean, you could tell that they're really stepping it up as far as instrumentation and just musicianship in general is concerned. It's just very solid. So next we got their most accessible album and the most successful album in the career of Judas Priest, and that is, of course, British Steel. Some might call the album overrated, and yeah, I can understand why. But this is, of course, a classic, and you can't go wrong with it. I mean, if you call yourself a metalhead and haven't checked out this album yet, you definitely need to check it out. Definitely an essential heavy metal record. I mean, you do got some classics on here like Breaking the Law, United, and Living After Midnight. This does have some of their most popular tracks. Very accessible sounding, and I would say if you're trying to get into the band, this would be a good introduction. This would be a very good start if you're looking to check these guys out. So yeah, really good album, and definitely a classic. So next, I'm not sure how some people will feel about me placing this album rather high in the ranking, because this is a later day Judas Priest album, but to me this is easily the best of their modern era. And I am, of course, talking about their latest album, Firepower. This album came out in 2018, and this is probably my favorite album of that year as well. I mean, this album is just absolutely solid. I remember my very first listen when the album, around the time when the album first came out. I was honestly mind blown. I mean, I was absolutely impressed from what I was hearing from this album. And, you know, this album really made me like the band more than I already did at the time, and it is just solid all around, front to back. This is just a very stellar album. Very good production, good songwriting. You know, you got some heavy moments on this album. Just incredible sounding guitar moments on this album. I mean, some really great tracks on this album include songs like Firepower, the title track, Lightning Strike, Evil Never Dies, easily one of the best tracks on the album, and Rising from Ruins, which I think is underrated. But yeah, very strong album from Judas Priest, especially this far in their career. And I do know that they are writing or they have new music in the works. I'm not sure what the current state is of the next Judas Priest album, but after this album, I'm definitely hyped for what they have to offer next. So next, we got Sad Wings of Destiny, another early day Judas Priest album. This is very early on in their career, and this does have some of their best work. It absolutely does, especially the song Victim of Changes, which is probably one of the best Judas Priest songs of all time. But yeah, definitely a classic that just offers so much. I mean, just stellar stuff right here. Definitely classic. So next, this album here, I know a lot of people would have it number one. I do know a few people that would place this at number one. Some people that I know personally here on YouTube, I know, say that this is their favorite Judas Priest album, and for me it's only at number 4. I can understand why it's number 1 for some people, but for me, I just think that there's a few albums that I think are better. That's all. But at number 4, I gotta go with Defenders of the Faith, and as you can see, this is a special edition of the album, which is very cool. I mean, this album is a classic, of course. Easily one of the best albums that they came out with in the 80s time, especially with songs like Free Will Burning, The Sentinel. Definitely some very good songs on this album. Songwriting and just song structure and everything this album has to offer is just excellent. But yeah, definitely some of their best work for sure. So now here we are at the top 3. Now, number 3, I know would make a lot of people's number 1. I can understand why. I think it's a very strong album from the band for sure. I would say it's their heaviest album, and with that being said, I think a lot of people have this album at number 1 for the wrong reasons. I think it's just because this is their heaviest album or whatever, and once again, heavy does not equivalate to better or best or whatever, you know. That's just not the case, in my opinion anyway. But still a very strong album nonetheless, and I am of course talking about their album Painkiller. Obviously a classic and a fan favorite Judas Priest album. It's not my number 1, but it's only at number 3 for me. But yeah, I would say that this is one of their best, and it is one of their best sounding albums and everything like that. And this does have some of their best songs, like the title track, and you got other great songs on here as well, like Metal Meltdown, and of course A Touch of Evil. I mean, a lot of really great tracks from this album. Once again, probably their heaviest album, and also one of their most epic sounding albums as well, which I really dig. I can dig this album a lot, so yeah, definitely very solid, definitely a classic, and I can definitely see why it's considered a favorite for a lot of people. But there's just 2 that I find to be a little bit stronger. So at number 2, now, this album has really grown on me a lot. Ever since I first listened to this album, I've really enjoyed it. I mean, this is just an absolutely terrific album from Judas Priest, and definitely a classic. It's my second favorite, and I would definitely consider it one of their best. And I am, of course, talking about Stained Class. Definitely a very strong album. I mean, really, you can't go wrong with any of the songs on this album. I mean, you got some very good songs on here, like Exciter, Savage, and Beyond the Realms of Death, which are just solid tracks. But once again, can't go wrong with anything from this album. But this album does have some of their best songs and some of their best songwriting, however you want to say it, of course. Yeah, this album just does everything right, in my opinion, so definitely one of their best. But at number one, this album has always been number one for me ever since I became a fan of Judas Priest, and this was also my introduction to the band as well. And I am talking about Screaming for Vengeance. Maybe one of the best metal albums of all time. I mean, once again, if you call yourself a metalhead, please do yourself a favor and listen to this album. Listen to it. It's terrific. It's just absolutely fantastic. Definitely a classic. Another album where you just can't go wrong with anything from this album. I think all the songs are excellent, but some of my favorites on here would have to be Electric Eye, Riding on the Wind, the title track, and You've Got Another Thing Coming, which is, of course, very accessible, very mainstream, and all of that stuff. But yeah, absolutely terrific album, and once again, not a bad song from this album. I think everything from this album is excellent. And once again, this was my introduction to the band, and if you're looking to check out the band, this would also be a very good start to getting into this band as well. So definitely a very strong album that I highly recommend to anyone who loves metal, of course, if you haven't heard it already. So Screaming for Vengeance is my number one favorite Judas Priest album. So that is my ranking for the band, Judas Priest. So let me know what you guys think. Are you a fan of the band? How would you rank their albums? What's your favorite songs from the band? Feel free to let me know. So with that being said, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day and take care.